Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. About a year ago, I started doing this occasional series where I go back and look at my old song analysis videos and correct the mistakes. You might think this was inspired by a general desire to learn and improve, but no, it's because of hurt. It's because of one mistake I made in one video that has haunted me for literal years. It's the most embarrassing thing I've ever published, and I think it's time to set the record straight. This video is sponsored by CuriosityStream. Normally in these videos I try to look at 3 or 4 songs, but because of my complicated relationship with this analysis, I'm gonna do something a bit different and just focus on hurt. Before we get to the big mistake though, there's some other things I want to address first, starting with the verse riff. Or at least that's what I said it was in the original video, but the reality is a little more complicated. Don't get me wrong, this is the basic structure and I think my analysis of it holds up, but I don't think Reznor ever actually plays it exactly like this. Almost every statement includes at least one of 3 variations. The first variation is one I did actually mention in the original video. He adds a D near the end of the first bar. This makes it clear that the underlying chord is B minor, and moving to a more consonant note helps release some of the tension generated by the tritone. It sort of brings the riff home. He does this on most of the statements after the first one, but he plays around with the volume of it a lot, so sometimes you get a strong, satisfying release, and other times it's more like a faint whisper. I couldn't pick out any discernible pattern to it, and in the context of the song, this unpredictability serves as a powerful metaphor for the numbness of addiction. You just keep playing the riff because you never know if the next time will be the one where it resolves. The second variation, though, is more structured. On the last note of the riff, he alternates between playing it in the same octave as the rest of the notes, like this, and playing it really high. This sudden jump puts it in an uncomfortable register. This is where things like screams and predator howls sit, so an unprepared leap to such a piercing high note is unnerving because it sounds like danger. The interval is also important. It's D over an E chord, the minor 7th, which to my ears at least is an incredibly hollow sound. Back in ear training classes, this was the hardest interval for me to recognize because it just sounds like nothing. It's a blank slate with no real character of its own, and here that deep sense of emptiness is exactly what the song needs. So why doesn't he do it every time? To preserve its power. What makes this leap so effective is that it's unprepared, but if he keeps doing it over and over, that's preparation. The low version lets you cool down, so you're never quite ready for the next high one. This brings us to the third variation, and this is where my transcription actually was a little off. I had an E on beat 4, but most of the time he doesn't actually play anything there. In fact, the only time he does play a note there, it's another D. The structure of the bar implies an E though, to match the shape of the D power chord in the first half, so you sort of mentally insert it yourself, or at least I do. It's pretty subtle and I didn't notice it at all the first time through, but it adds a bit more uneasiness to the song. You keep expecting an E and not actually getting it, like a hole in the fabric of the music. That said, I do still think it's fair to analyze the riff as if it's there. After all, the effect relies on you believing it will be. I also want to talk about the rhythm a bit. The first bar is dominated by these long held notes, while the second bar is using all the 8th notes, or at least all of them except for that missing E. This creates a beautiful push-pull dynamic that they further accentuate in a couple ways. For starters, there's the chords. The fast bar has 2, while the slow bar has 1. This change in harmonic rhythm creates a deeper, more all-encompassing sense of slowness. But also, the slow bar isn't immediately slow. It starts off with that same 8th note power chord walk-up, so it feels like it's got the same energy, but then it just hits a brick wall and stops, leaving you hanging in the middle of nowhere. And what notes do they leave you hanging on? It's the tritone, one of the most dissonant intervals in Western music. Taken together, this creates a sense that you're starting to rise out of whatever hole you're trapped in, building up momentum to put your life back together, but in the end, you always fall back down. It's a musical ode to the destructive cycle of addiction. If he'd ended on something bright and happy, maybe this would feel like an escape, but he doesn't. He ends on a tritone, and the message there is clear. Speaking of dissonance, another thing I didn't really talk about is the noise. This track is full of non-harmonic noise elements. There's something that sounds like wind running throughout, and the verses also have this weird distortion to them that seems like it sits on top of the music itself. It's a deeply unnatural sound that almost makes you wonder if your speakers are broken, but they're not, that's just how the song goes. It's disturbing on its own, creating this low rumbling that makes it hard to focus on the music, but it gets even more disturbing when viewed in the context of the album as a whole. The Downward Spiral is a concept album about addiction, depression, and self-abuse, and in the second to last track, also called The Downward Spiral, the protagonist shoots himself in the face. This is followed by Hurt, the final track, which is a reflection on that action. In this context, the distortion takes on a much more literal meaning. thing. If you listen closely, it's more prominent on the left side. It's the loss of hearing from firing a gun so close to his ear. He literally can't hear the music to his left, and thanks to the distortion, neither can you. But okay, I've put it off long enough, let's talk about the pre-chorus. This is where things went wrong. The first thing I noticed here was that he was playing a drone. Every chord voicing he plays includes an A and E on top, even if they don't make much sense with the rest of the notes. Together, these form an A power chord, so every chord has a touch of that A tonality to it. Combine that with the fact that the first chord he plays in this section is a full A power chord, the only chord this drone feels stable over, and I naturally decided to read this section in that key, but I really shouldn't have. Everything else that went wrong in this analysis stemmed from that initial mistake. You see, the problem is the options for analyzing this in A kinda suck. The best I could come up with was that it was like a harmonic trill that got interrupted by the 4 chord, but then to justify that reading I had to go back and make an argument that the verse was secretly an A too because the melody ended on that note sometimes, which isn't really how keys work. It was kind of a mess. Fortunately, the comment section was quick to point out my mistake. I'd assumed the drone had to be on the 1 chord, but it's not unheard of to have a drone on the 5 instead. That would put us in D, and there's plenty of good evidence that that's what's happening. For starters, the D chord is the only one in the section that has an actual chord quality. The rest are power chords with the drone on top, but on D he adds an F sharp above the E, giving us a clear major triad. Plus, the verses were in B minor, and D is what's called the relative major of that key, which means it has all the same notes, it just uses them differently. Shifting between relative major and minor keys is really smooth, but it can have a significant impact on the emotion of the piece. In fact, I'd say this pre-chorus almost sounds hopeful. The protagonist is in a dark place, but he's starting to understand his situation. That hope doesn't last, but don't worry, we'll get there. But the best argument for reading this in D is that if that's the root, then this is actually a really common chord loop called the axis progression. You may have heard me call this the 4-chord progression before, but theorist Mark Richards proposed the name axis progression, and I like it, so I'm switching to that. Same chords though. Point is, if we view it in D, then we have a ready-made analytical framework we can just drop it right into, and I'm a little embarrassed that I didn't notice it at the time. But, well, is this in D? Because here's the thing about the axis progression. It can rotate. Because of the way the chords fit together, it can support a couple different roots depending on its use. If D is the root, then we're playing the major axis variation, but there's also the minor axis variation, which in this case would start on B, keeping us in the same key as the verse. There's also the dominant axis variation starting on A, which is what I initially said it was, and even the Lydian axis variation, which would start on G, but those are less common and they're probably not the best lens here. Because of the F sharp, I'd say this section is probably better viewed as the major axis progression, but it seems worth considering the minor as well because of the rhythm. I said the first chord he plays is the A chord, and that's true, but I'm not sure it's actually the start of the loop. After the verse, the vocals lay out for almost 30 seconds while he plays through the loop twice on guitar, and when he starts singing again, it's over the B chord. That becomes the start of the loop, even though it's not where the loop started. This has a really interesting effect. He's playing even sets of 4 bars, but because he's managed to trick you into hearing the second bar as the first one, all the transitions feel like they're coming early. The chorus has a pickup bar, and then it cuts back to the verse a bar before you expect it to, even though on paper it should all add up. And let's talk about the chorus, because basically every transcription I could find says the pre-chorus progression continues through, but it doesn't. The D chord disappears, replaced with another A chord instead. Check it out. That's supposed to be D major, but I can't find a D anywhere. I mean, I suppose I might have missed it, but I looked real hard this time and even checked with some friends and no one could identify a D. This means we're going A, B, G, A, which... hold on, that looks like the harmonic trill I was describing the first time. Was I secretly right all along? No, not really. Or, I mean, it's a fair analysis of this section, but as I mentioned earlier, I think it's better viewed as going B, G, A, A, basically adopting the minor axis variation and avoiding the major root altogether to make it clear we've left that hope behind. In its place, we put the flat 7 chord, which is fairly unstable, and we just sort of hang out there for a while before sliding back up to the 1 and starting over. It has a similar kind of push-pull to the verse, with short bursts of energy running into long bouts of stasis. And finally, there's the ending. We get the chorus one last time, then the section ends with a sudden introduction of this huge distorted guitar. which as far as I can tell is just playing power chords. It starts on A, our original drone, which resolves to D, the key we tried to escape to in the pre-chorus, and then it continues down to B, the key we've actually been in the whole time. It's one final humiliation for our protagonist, trapped forever in this downward spiral. From there, it spends like a minute and a half sitting on a bunch of extreme distortion and feedback that they fade in and out to create a harsh, brutal soundscape, before finally ending on that lonely wind sound that's been sitting beneath everything the entire time. And I think that's pretty much it, but before I wrap up, I want to address one more thing. How did this happen? How did I wind up publishing a video with such an obvious error in it? Honestly, I hate to admit this, but I rushed it. The video was supposed to go out on the first week of January, but I was traveling for the winter holidays that year. I was going to be away from my equipment for 3 weeks, but I only wanted to take 2 weeks off, so I spent the December beforehand working ahead to try to prep an extra video that I could publish remotely before I got home. This meant that I couldn't give it the time it needed, and since I couldn't cut down on the production time, that meant cutting back on research instead. My analytical process usually involves listening to the song a lot to try to pick out all the nuances I can find, but here I kinda skipped that and worked more from my transcriptions because it was faster. I thought I saw something on the page, so I just went with it, and I got burned. I'm sorry. In the years since, I've taken a lot of steps to reduce the risk of that happening, including cutting back on the number of videos I make per month and building better protocols for working ahead when I have to, and a lot of that came from the lessons I learned from the mistakes of this video. Of course, that doesn't mean you'll always agree with my analysis, and that's fine, that's how music theory works. Song analysis is a chronicling of personal experience, and everyone experiences music differently. But at the very least, these days, I try to make sure that I agree with my analysis, and looking back at the old Hurt video, I really can't say that I do. I'm glad I got the chance to correct it, but I'm still sorry I had to. I've actually been thinking about this song a lot lately thanks to my podcast on Nebula, and yeah, I have a podcast. It's called Ghost Notes, and it largely consists of me and Noah from Polyphonic aggressively agreeing with each other about music. It's been a lot of fun to make. Noah and I both spend a lot of time thinking about music, but we approach it from such different angles. I've learned a lot from talking to him, and I hope he's learned something from me too. Our most recent episode is all about lyrics, so of course we had to talk about how Johnny Cash transformed this song in his cover, and we even got so into the topic of cover songs that we wound up dedicating a whole nother episode just to them that's coming out in January, so make sure to subscribe and watch out for that if you want to hear us talk about Hurt even more. Ghost Notes is a Nebula original podcast, which means all the episodes go up a month early over there. The lyrics episode is up exclusively on Nebula right now, and if you want to check it out, we've worked out an amazing deal where if you sign up for CuriosityStream with a link in the description, not only will you get their best holiday discount with 41% off an annual plan, you'll also get Nebula free for as long as you remain a CuriosityStream member. That's 2 sites of great educational content, including awesome documentaries on CuriosityStream like the Frank Sinatra biopic America's Golden Age for under $12 for the entire year if you act now. And hey, thanks for watching, thanks to our Patreon patrons for making these videos possible, and extra special thanks to this video's featured patrons, Duck and Howard Levine. If you want to help out and help us pick the next song we analyze too, there's a link to our Patreon on screen now. You can also join our mailing list to find out about new episodes, like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.